Hello. Well, um, we are looking at a few different things here. On the left here is a V45 out of a Sabre or Magna. That's only going to be the 82 to 88 model years. And 86 on up, there are some head differences, kind of significant, but overall the engine itself is the same. If you look beyond the heads, everything else is the same. Now, this one over here is a V45 again, but this one is out of the Interceptor. So this is going to be the VF750F and the VF700F. And this is going to be the VF750S, VF750C, VF700C, VF700S. Whew. That's a lot. And again, these are only going to be 82 to 88, and then 83 to 85. Now, why did I say 700 and 750? Well, because there was a tariff placed on all motorcycles imported into the United States in 1984, and that ended in, I believe, 1987. So, but what happened was the tariff fee was so high that Honda, among other bike manufacturers, found it more beneficial to convert their 750s into 700s. And then they just continued selling the 700s because the tariff affected all bikes over 700 cubic centimeters. Sorry. So that's what happened. 1984, pretty much all the 750s became 700s in the United States. In Canada, they primarily remain just 750s. Now, the V4s, here's how they went about converting them. With the V4s, the 750, it was de-stroked. So they removed a little bit of stroke from the crankshaft. And then that's all that happened to make that into a 700. But to compensate for the otherwise loss of compression, they changed the rod sizes, and then they changed the piston shape. So the 700 pistons have a much more dramatic dome or crown on them than the 750 pistons do. So, but that's kind of where the 750 and 700 thing stops. And it's the same deal with both the engines, whether you have the Magna Sabre or if you have the Interceptor. I mean, that's the basics, and luckily that's kind of all you'll need to know from here on out. But what we'll talk about now is the difference between these two engines themselves. And some other time, I will have a video up amongst all the differences between the 750 and 700s. There's not many. Like I said, it was mostly the stroke thing. The only other differences were coincidental. So 84 on up had better shift forks, and then there was the cylinder head change in 86, like I mentioned. Blah, blah, blah. Not too important right now. But with the Magna and Interceptor, there are a fair number of differences going on. And you would normally think, oh, they're just the same engine. You know, they're all VF700s, they're all VF750s, you know, what's the difference? Well, there's a few apparent ones, and you can see exactly what I'm seeing. And it's easy to see some of the differences. So we'll start at the top down. So the Magna, Sabre, and Interceptor all share the same valve covers. It's the same exact size dimensionally. However, on the Magnas and Sabres, the rear one is a two-piece valve cover. On the Interceptor, they're both single-piece ones. And it's kind of neat. When you take these valve covers off, you'll see on the inside, they show two Honda code numbers. They'll show one for, I believe, MB0, and then another for MB4. And then each one of those, one is placed on this end, one is placed on this end. And each code has an arrow that points that way. Because depending on whether these went on the Interceptor or Magna dictates which direction these point. And yes, that is completely true. I'm not just fabricating lines. These guys are directional. Do keep that in mind. You can kind of see it on camera. It's really hard to see on camera, but you can see it on camera. But this side of the valve cover is longer than this side. And that's the only difference, is it's just got a little bit more length on one side than the other, but only in the cam chain area. And you can tell that because this one, for instance, is mounted on backwards. See how you can see the mating surface of the cylinder head? There's a good almost a 1/4 inch exposed. And then when you look on the other side, there's a little bit overhanging. That's because this cylinder head cover was put on backwards. But otherwise, yeah, cylinder head covers, they fit amongst both the Sabre, Magna, and Interceptor engines. And it's kind of cool because, well, one, you have better parts availability. So when your covers are scuzzy like this guy, it makes it much easier to find real pretty ones. Even better is if you have an Interceptor, a decent modification is to replace the rear single piece valve cover with the rear dual piece valve cover of the Magna Sabre. Why would you do that? Well, for the Magna and Sabre, this rear valve cover was 2-piece, so that it was easier to adjust the valves. Inside the Magna and Sabre, we can see here, I'll walk up to one. Right here is one. You can see things are kind of tight. Obviously you have to remove the tank, but there's only about 1 inch between the valve cover and the frame, so the only way you can adjust the valves on the Magna and Sabre is to have that 2-piece valve cover. Now on the Interceptor, that has a more race-like frame. Let me show you. It's not aluminum, it's steel, but it more resembles this Honda Hawk frame, where the frame just comes straight down almost at a 45-degree angle. And I'll show you on an engine here. On the Interceptor, the frame kind of comes right through here, and it has a little mounting ear triangle that you can bolt and unbolt for that mounting bolt, but the frame comes through here, and it follows this valve cover parallel. So, but if you put the 2-piece, here we go, the 2-piece valve cover on an Interceptor makes it a little easier to adjust the valves. Removing the single one isn't all that difficult in an Interceptor, but it's not needed. It's kind of big, it's kind of gangly. You have to fish it around a couple things in the frame, and I find that when you use this guy, it's a little easier. Well, obviously when they made the Magna and Sabre, they found out that this lower section, being where it is, doesn't make doing the valve adjustment job any more difficult. Kind of. It's kind of difficult with this guy here as opposed to the front, but what helps us a lot is when you can lift up this lower piece with this top removed. With the top removed, you lift up this lower piece, and you'll have a good inch or so of clearance to go in there and get at any adjustment nuts you have to. But usually you have good enough clearance to get at all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, with only this top one removed and this lower one just sitting here. Helps prevent oil leaks that way, if you don't have to touch the bottom one. So that's the valve cover difference. Next is going to be the head difference. Now there's a lot of differences between these heads. Remember how I said these cylinder head covers are directional, and that they go on different directions, whether they're for the Magna, Sabre, or Interceptor? Well, here's why. The Interceptor spins backwards compared to the Magna Sabre. There's a few reasons for this. If you look at all the literature from Honda, Honda says that the Interceptor engine spins the opposite direction of the Magna for better gyroscopic forces in cornering. So supposedly they did that alone to help cornering. However, when we consider the transmission, it's more likely that the Interceptor engine turns the different direction because it doesn't have any bevel drives to go through. So I'd have to sit down and see if that's actually the case or not. Going off the top of my head, I can't remember, but there is that. And that means a few things. It means that the chain tensioners have to be orientated backwards. And because the heads of the Magna Sabre were made a certain way, well, obviously the valve covers are backwards, like I said, for the Interceptor, but also the heads are made a little different as well. Here, you can see that this valve cover is on backwards too. See how it overhangs the front, but comes up short on the rear? It's because that valve cover is on backwards. Again, that's directional, and the heads are directional. And the other thing with the heads have different mounting holes in them. With the Interceptors, the engines are all mounted solid onto the frame. Whereas the Magnas, well, the Magnas and Sabres, they all use rubber bushings, these guys. And they kind of dampen the shake, but not really much, because when you torque these guys down, it makes this pretty stiff. Really, the only ones that do any dampening are these forward mounting ones, because the way they bolt on to the frame is such that they actually kind of do help dampen. But these upper ones, they don't do too much dampening. But anyhow, all the motor mounts are solid on the Interceptor, and there's one additional one. So we'll look at the Magna real quick. Here's the Magna. This is the rear motor mount. Now down below, there is a bolt that goes through the bottom of the engine, and on each end of that, there would normally be another one of these rubber dampeners, one per side, and they go through the frame. And then the forward lower mount, there's two of these rubber dampeners. There's one on this corner, and then there's another one symmetrically on the other side of the engine. And that's it. You only have those 3 pairs of mounts for the Magna and Sabre engines. The Interceptor engine, because it's solid mounted, they kind of converted all these rubber mounts into solid ones. So while there were big gaping holes like this so you could fit a rubber bushing, they've been filled with aluminum, and then they all have, I believe, a steel guide insert, just so it keeps the bolt you insert from chewing up the aluminum, because over time the engine does move a tad, and it's very easy to egg shape these holes when they're only aluminum. So they did that with the upper two, and with the lower one they didn't change anything, because on the Magna and Sabre the rubber mounts were part of the frame and not part of the engine. They didn't do anything with the Interceptor. They just left it the way it was. But they added a mount. They added this one right here onto the rear cylinder head. Now, if anyone's familiar with the V45 differences, I mean, that's going to be the difference between the V65 Magna and the V65 Sabre. It's the similar stuff. The Sabre has an additional hard mount on one of the two heads, and it also has all the rubber mounts converted into solid ones. So, neat little tidbit there. But so that's kind of the main difference between the heads, and you know you have the Interceptor ones because there will be that mounting bolt on the rear head, and because that's there, they cut into the fins some. So while the fins are normally all rounded like the front cylinder head of the Interceptor, and all of these cylinder heads of the Magna and Sabre, this rear one is cut out a little bit more. Aside from that, the heads are kind of the same, but you don't want to get them confused. If you order up a front Interceptor head in place of a front Magna head, or vice versa, you're going to have some issues. Like I said, the chain tensioners had to be flipped from one side to the other side, and because of that, there is an interference issue. You won't really be able to assemble things right. You'll have interference issues with your chain guides and chain tensioners when you go to assemble the round head onto the round engine. Not to mention when you have the rear head on the front cylinder or vice versa, you'll never be able to mount up your exhaust. Your head pipes will never mount up, whether it's the rear or the front. Now, since we're talking about head pipes, we'll probably just go over that real quick. The head pipes between the Interceptor and the Magna actually kind of are the same. If there are any differences, it's maybe length. You can see here on the Interceptor engine, they go down a ways and they meet up kind of just to the right of center of the rear cylinder head. And when we look at our Magna Sabre, it's the same story, but the heat shields are different. As you can see, the Interceptors are very short, while the Magna Sabre ones go down a long ways. And it's just because when you have with the Interceptors, when you have this chain cover on, you can't see the rest of the heat shield anyways, so why have it? Versus the Magna Sabre, you naturally see some of that stuff. When these engines are fully dressed, there is a plastic cover that goes over the top of this section. Depending on the year, it's aluminum. Anyhow, there's a cover, and you can still see some of that heat shield up until about this point, and then the rest kind of disappears. Otherwise, the head pipes seem identical. They're made out of some sort of stainless steel. I couldn't tell you the grade, but there is some sort of stainless steel. And the heat shields on the Interceptor ones, they seem a lot less prone to rusting than they do on the Magna Sabre ones. I believe the Magna Sabre ones are a chrome steel, and the Interceptor ones I think might be a stainless. But again, that varies by year. The heat shields for the 86 on up do look different. They're actually louvered, kind of like the V45 ones. But again, getting ahead of myself. The lower head pipes, those are very different. Okay, and I'm going to be talking about the ones with the power chamber. That is the power chamber. For those who don't know, it's this canister chamber underneath the rear head pipes. And Honda says that is designed to produce optimum torque without sacrificing horsepower. But we found some of these power chambers on their 80s bikes don't necessarily do that. They're more of a sound deadener. Some are specifically there to have a twin outlet exhaust like this, one per side. And then when they have a single, they tend to cap one off. That's what the story is with the VT500. But sound deadening seems, from my perspective, priority number one for the power chambers, but they claim it helps power and torque and fuel economy. Not too critical with what we're talking about today. The head pipes, you can see they're quite different. Obviously on the Magna and Sabre, they're this shape, and they're always either chrome or black chrome. Like what's on that Sabre, you can see the black head pipes coming out of that leading cylinder head. The later Sabres are black like that, but most of them are just this chrome. And later models of the Magnas have different outlets. Again, not too important. But the shape is quite different. The shape is very unique. On the Magna Sabre, it is parallel with the Earth, as is the Interceptor one. However, there are some additional bends. When we look at the Interceptor one, you can see that it bends out and around before it goes down and under. Well, the Magna Sabre ones, they just go straight to the point. Why is this? Well, on the Interceptor, they were able to fit two radiators. So they had one above, like this radiator on the Sabre, but then they also had one below the cylinder head. And it fit right between these two leading head pipes. Why is that? Well, part of the gyroscopic forces Honda was trying to achieve for better cornering, what they had also done was they took the engine and they slanted it backwards some. So I have these two engines lying perfectly flat on the ground in comparison to the camera. And when I zoom out far enough, you can see that the Interceptor engine is almost perfectly split. If I were to measure this head, it's almost at 45 degrees. It's maybe 35. While this Magna rear head, you can see it's closer to like 15, maybe 20 degrees, something like that. And then of course the front bank is 90 degrees off of that. So we do this. I know it's very scientific, but there is an obvious difference. Yeah, that's quite the difference. And you can see it better when you have the bikes side by side because they're properly mounted and everything. But even still, they're based off of how the pipes lay flat. Because when these are on their bikes, the pipes still are flat to the earth, depending on whether a rider's on them or not. They don't change too much, but you know. So, because of that, yes, they were able to fit 2 radiators around the Sabre, or the Interceptor engine, versus only the single one of the Sabre and Magna like this. So that means that the sides of the engine look quite different. And they do. Sure enough, they do. These side covers, they look very different. This is what the Interceptor one looks like. You can see this. Look at those lower 4 bolts. Kind of draw a line with those. And then draw a line with these top 2 bolts where the engine serial number is. Those 2 point upward, like so. And they're pretty parallel to each other, but just remember they point upward when we walk on over to our Magna Sabre engine. Huh, look at that. These are a little different. These are horizontal. See the engine plaque and lower 4 bolts are perfectly horizontal. It's part of what they did to rotate the engine. So the crankcases between these guys are very similar. The biggest difference between these is just going to be these engine mounts. But some other time I will have a video between the internal differences, but just to clear out the big stuff, that's what this video is for. There's a lot of external differences, and it kind of dictates, you know, what you can do internally. So start here, then you move on to the internal stuff. But anyhow, yes, these crankcases are more or less the same. If I hold the camera like this and we stare at this one, and then we come over here, we're looking at the same thing if you forget the cylinder heads and the side cover. Now even the side covers are perfectly interchangeable. But one thing I should note is that even though the starters interchange, because it's the same clutch cover, or I should say it's the same clutch cover template, so it's got the same bolt pattern, it takes the same exact gasket even. But the covers themselves are quite different, and it's very apparent when you have them, when you try putting one on instead of the other, because the word Honda will be skewed like that, depending on what engine you put on what. So you can see there's a gentle skew. It's kind of more obvious on the other side, but it's quite there. The lower lines are probably the better giveaway for it, because those are horizontal with the bottom of the case being like that, versus this one. They're just flat. But the starter, it bolts in because the cases are mostly the same. But because the Interceptor engine turns the opposite direction of the Magna Sabre one, your starter has to turn the opposite direction. Yes, there is a difference in starters, and I'll include that in the description, because you can tell which is which based off of the code that's on the starter. The starter, so this is the starter that you'll see on a Magna or Sabre. On the back side of it, you can't see it, but on the back side of the starter, it would be down in here, there will be a green, red, or blue chrome sticker. And depending on the code on that sticker will dictate which direction it turns, as well as how many teeth are on it. Again, they'll have the Honda code on it. So one will be MBO, one will be MB4, and I believe the V45s are MB2s. Anyhow, I'll have all that in the description for you to look at. But putting the wrong starter on the wrong engine is quite interesting. You'll have it all hooked up. You'll fill up all the oil again. You go to turn the starter over, and all you'll hear is because it turns the same way as the starter clutch. So the starter clutch never locks because you have the motor turning the wrong way. It's like if your starter was locked up and the engine was running, you'd never know. The engine would keep running and the starter will just sit there. That's how starter clutches work. So do keep that in mind. Now the exhausts, like I said, they are different and they're not interchangeable. Same with the front heads and the rear heads. Side covers are interchangeable, but that doesn't mean you'd want to interchange them. Like I said, where they say Honda, it's angled differently. How they both are parallel to the earth. But if we were to cock the angles of them, things would look a little different. And yes, the flywheel covers are interchangeable. They take the same exact gasket. They take the same bolts. The covers are interchangeable as long as you can stomach the what would be a slanted difference between them. So we've covered most of the external stuff. There's a few things left. The last big thing is going to be the fact that the Interceptor is chain drive instead of shaft drive to the rear wheels. So that alone is a huge difference. So on the Sabre and Magna engines, there's this back area of the engine, and it bolts onto the engine. It's what I call the shaft output housing, or the bevel gear housing, because this is the output, and this is hooked up to a bevel gear that's here, and it interacts with the bevel gear here, which turns the shaft right above this oil sender. And then over here is our clutch. A water pump is down here. The water pumps are different between these. You can see how that one's triangular and it's webbed. And then look at this part of the housing. It's more or less straight. It's pretty clean. Go over here, look at the one for the Magna Sabre. It's pretty bulbous here. And it's not triangular. It's perfectly round. There's minimal webbing. They're quite different. And the reason for that is with the different frames and the different radiators, there is different coolant routing, at least for this rear left corner of the engine. It has to send the coolant around the frame on the Interceptor, or behind it. I can't remember. I think it's around the frame. Into the lower radiator before going back up into the upper radiator, before going past the airbox down into these tubes. The Magna Sabre actually route the coolant from the water pump into the frame. So if I walk on over to our Magna Sabre frame, you can see this section of frame is removable, and coolant actually does flow through it. There you can see where the frame has a bung that sends coolant into the radiator. It's quite interesting. And then from the radiator, it goes past the airbox and then down into these center coolant passage tubes that go between the two cylinder heads. But getting back to the rear housings, they actually take this, I'm going to say they take the same gasket that goes between the output housing and the crankcases. Same story over here, but there is one difference. One of these two, I can't remember which, so either the Interceptor or the Magna Sabre has one additional hole somewhere in the gasket. And I can't remember where, and with these chain sprocket covers on, it's hard to tell, because underneath that there are a few more bolts or a few less bolts. Again, I can't remember. When I get to the internal difference video, I'll go over that in better detail. But yes, there's that again. And there's a difference in transmissions. Like you can see here, it says on the cover with the Interceptor, 1 neutral, 2, 3, 4, 5. With the Interceptor, with the Sabre and Magna, the covers that come on here, they'll say 1 neutral, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the shafties have a 6th gear. All the Interceptors, chain-driven motors, they only have the 5. And you actually are able to convert one to the other, but it's kind of involved. I'll also have a video on that alone sometime later this season when I have more of these ripped down side by side. I've ripped down many, but I haven't had the space to have 2 different ones side by side out on the bench. But we keep moving on to our coolant tubes. This one that wraps around the flywheel cover on both engines, totally the same. This little black housing that it goes to next between these engines is totally the same. The next coolant passage tube between these engines, totally the same. And the last black coolant housing hub, completely the same. And they take all the same O-rings and gaskets for all the coolant passageways. But what goes between the cylinder heads is quite different. So this is our Interceptor, coolant passageways between the heads. See how they're all, what I'll say is flat plane. This is one outlet, this is another, and they're almost perfectly level with each other. On the on the Magna Sabre, they're on different planes. See how that rear tubing has a bung on the bottom that connects to the front one, and the rear tube also has a bung that goes up near the air box where it can hook up to the thermostat housing. So that's a big difference. You won't be able to interchange these tubes between the Magna Sabre and the Interceptor. What works on one will not work on the other. And there's a few different reasons for that. One is the frame, the next one is the air box. But otherwise, I think the thermostat housings are similar, compatible, interchangeable maybe? Can't remember. But I think the last part on our list is going to be the oil feed line. Now, from 82 to 83, there are some oil feed line changes. They had used some different bolts. I don't think I have any here in front of me. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But the bolts you can't really tell apart from afar, but when you undo them, you'll see that the unthreaded shoulder is totally different between them. One of them is completely round and takes up the majority of this banjo bolt fitting, while the other one is triangular and it fits inside this and it has 3 big gaps along the 3 sides of the triangle, presumably for better oil flow. But the hard line is otherwise the same. You won't find a single difference between the Interceptor one and the Magna Sabre one. But yes, that pretty much concludes everything. I suppose one last thing will be the clutch slave cylinder. So this is the Interceptor clutch slave cylinder. So if you remember that, there's a bolt here, a bolt here, a bolt here. So on the left side, it makes a 90-degree over here. It's the same way, but because the engine is angled a little differently, it's orientated a little differently. But the clutch slave has a bleeder in a different location. Because it's angled differently, the air travels to a different spot of the slave depending on which one you're trying to use. And you'll only be able to use the Interceptor one on the Interceptor and the Magna Sabre one on the Magna Sabre, unless you have custom lines and a few other things. But the location of these guys is quite unique. This will be in the internals video more, but the clutch push rod is going to be longer on the Interceptor engine than it is on the Magna Sabre one, because when we look down, when I plant the camera right on the cylinder head, you barely see the banjo bolt of that slave down there. It's perfectly in line with the slave housing. Go over to our Interceptor one. Hold on, big difference, muchacho. Sitting out at least an inch. And so your your clutch push rod will be about an inch difference between these, unless they used maybe a longer spacer at the clutch end. Again, I'd have to have these apart side by side to remember that specific part. But otherwise, I think the only remaining different part is going to be the shift shaft. So if we look on our Magna Sabre, again, we'll put the camera, set it so that the valve cover is dead flush. And it's actually flush with the casting that the shift shaft comes out of. We go hop over to our Interceptor and, oh look, there's a shaft. It's sticking out a ways. Yeah, that too sticks out about an inch more. But yes, that pretty much covers everything external. Anyhow, a lot of the external hardware is the same. I should point out that all the gaskets between these are interchangeable except for the shaft output. Yeah, the seal. That's going to be a lot different from the seal that they put on the sprocket gasket. Or sprocket seal, sorry. But yeah, all the bolts between the valve covers and the valve cover gaskets and the head bolts and the head gaskets and the flywheel cover bolts and the flywheel cover gaskets and the clutch cover bolts and the clutch cover gaskets and the exhaust head pipe gaskets. The exhaust pipes themselves actually take different gaskets. Part of the difference between them is the Interceptor has a larger outlet than the Magna Sabre. But otherwise, a lot of the hardware is the same. And again, when I make the video comparing the internals, that one is quite fascinating because there's a lot of same and some slightly different parts. But it all adds up to you making a killer V45 so long as you have access to a selection of parts like I do. But this video is plenty long. I hope you're not too bored. Oh, they all take the same oil filter. I wanted to point that out too. They take the same spark plugs. But yes, if there's any questions, definitely feel free to say so in the comments. If I got anything wrong, I'm pretty darn sure I didn't. The only thing I'm iffy on is that clutch push rod and the number of bolt holes between the two different output housing gaskets. So aside from that, everything else I said is dead on, snots on, true as true can be. And like I said, the internals video is quite interesting. So everything I said is kind of law, unless I said otherwise. So don't be trying to buy Interceptor parts assuming that every single one will fit for your Magna Sabre, and vice versa. There's a lot of differences. Not everything is going to be directly interchangeable. And like I said, some of the parts will interchange, like these side covers, but they won't look nice. You'll put them on and you'll think, oh, these don't line up at all. Honda looks funny when it's going across the screen like this, unless you're on your back wheel and not on your front. But yes, I'll let you guys go. And yes, we will get around to the internals video. We'll also get around to one going between the 750 and the 700s so that you can see the differences between them. It's not much. Spoiler alert. Oh, and before I walk off, everyone's always asking, oh, what's the difference between the V45 and the V65? A lot of physical space. V65 is physically larger, much larger than these guys. The heads of, or I should say the valve covers of the V65 are as wide as the heads of the V45. And everyone also asks, what's the difference between the V30? That's going to be the VF500, those who don't know, and the V45s. Well, they look kind of similar from afar, but believe me, they're different. The V30 is tiny. It is tiny. The mounting bolts are closer together than the VT500. The VT500 is nice and compact. And there's a lot of differences between this and the 700 and 750. So the V45s, they're their own deal. They got nothing in common with the V65, except, ironically, the flywheel cover. And they have nothing in common with the V30s, absolutely nothing. The only common thing you'll see between these is some hardware. Like the seals that go between these guys is coincidentally the same. And then some of the rocker hardware, sync screws are always the same. Some of the rocker pivots, I think the rocker pivots are the same, but you know, you're splitting hairs if you're trying to compare those. So just know that they're two totally different. If you're trying to swap one into the other, it's not going to work. Whether you have the V65, the V45, or V30, not a single one is going to easily fit into the other without severe modifications. But yeah, that's enough ragging on for now. Yes, so I'll can it, let you guys go, and hopefully you learned something. Hopefully I answered questions that you might have had. If I missed anything, do say so. Otherwise, this should be everything you could possibly ever need until we get to the internals video. So stay excited for that and stay tuned.